Sí, no tiene mucho sentido. Estaba pensando en un restaurante que... Hay un restaurante que se llama División del Norte, cerca de División Pacífico, que vende, se anuncia, es un lugar muy americano, de Kansas City Style Barbecue, pero obviamente no es una opción para quienes vienen de allá.
A mí me acaban de apuntar uno, también se supone en un restaurante barbecue, se llama Chicken.
Sí, no, tampoco es una buena opción. No.
Se llama la barba.
No, yo tengo unas opciones. Bueno, una opción es comida mexicana. ¿Conoces un lugar que se llama está en la plaza central de y ahí los platos más atractivos son tostadas de mariscos, camarón, son muy buenos.
También está un corazón de ella.
Yeah.
Pero tú haciendo corazón de ella.
She doesn't.
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, she's gorgeous.
Cuando vino la liga, fuimos ahí.
Ah, yes. That's
Ahí
right.
es comida oaxaqueña.
Good. Was she?
Yo creo que es un poco de la
Was she
cervecería.
there and me?
En la cervecería te comes unas tostadas.
No, she's a great student. It's great to have her there.
She's doing great there.
Yes.
Tienes demasiado
Nice. Striving, doing good work.
calorie intake, tal vez.
Dos tostadas.
So we did our master's.
Sí, yo con dos
Ah, okay.
¿Quién come dos tostadas? Yo puedo sacar dos tostadas.
pero las sonaste bien.
Oh,
No, no lo voy a hacer.
No, actually, no. I'm.
Él dice que necesita para cenar más de dos tostadas.
so you do more cakes.
Yeah.
Le creo, no pongo en duda que sea que está sobre sí mismo.
No, pero yo creo que sí hablo sobre tickets.
Before you work, you
So
said.
I'm still working my kids. So
De hecho, hay 10 que
Yo también.
Sí, comida. They have a great program there. It's a nice place.
tú eres el que todavía tiene algo de otra latitud. Pero no te preocupes. Te doy una de mis tostadas.
Y solo hacemos uno.
Sí.
Vamos a la cervecería.
Estoy de acuerdo.
Ok, pero yo no soy hardcore. Yo soy
¿Eres duro? ¿Inflexible?
¿Creo que siento?
Sí.
¿Qué le estás diciendo?
Ah, ok, sí, por supuesto, sería para mí un placer, pero voy a ser duro.
Esa es la actitud, Axel.
Gracias.
Entonces no voy a dar como.
Pero aún así, ¿cuánto tiempo tiene entonces?
45.
De hecho, creo que vamos a empezar prácticamente 15 minutos
Ah,
tarde.
perfecto, entonces ahora.
No te vale que se gane.
¿Sí? Mi corazón no puede.
Y en el posgrado es más caro, todos son pegados. Por eso se van al ejército.
in case you need.
Oh, thanks.
Oh, by the way, good morning.
Morning.
Do you mind being interrupted, or you want all questions, both clarifying and until the end?
No, I don't mind being interrupted. I just reserve the right to be like, let's hold that for later.
Oh, yeah, that makes lots of sense.
So Seth, did you change your views last night?
I did not change my views. We're saving that for about now.
Everybody have a hand up? One more. Thank you. Anyone else?
Bueno, ya que cerraron la puerta, supongo que ese es señal oficial que vamos a empezar, o todos esperemos. Ok. Bueno, muchísimas gracias, bienvenidos todos y gracias por acompañarnos en el segundo día del taller de aspectos filosóficos de la modalidad. El día de hoy pues vamos a empezar precisamente con la plática de Seth Yalcin de la Universidad de Berkeley, de la Universidad de California en Berkeley. Que va a tener 40, you have 45 minutes to talk. Vamos a tener 45 minutos de la plática, después se van a abrir el espacio para preguntas. También pueden hacer preguntas de clarificación durante la plática. Y si alguien tiene algún problema con el idioma, pues puede hacer la pregunta en español y algunos encontrarán una manera de traducirlo para que sepan comunicar. El moderador hará el esfuerzo de encontrar la manera de traducirlo al inglés. Y bueno, por supuesto también durante la sesión de preguntas. Okay? Well, thank you.
All right, thanks so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me. Okay, so I wanted to use this talk to talk a little bit about the way that knowledge ascription interacts with indicative conditionals and related modal operators. And I think so I'm going to talk about a little puzzle. The handout that I have here is just kind of describing the puzzle as I'm currently thinking of it. I feel like, so one part of the talk is a negative talk. It's like, here's a puzzle. What do we say about it? I'll spend part of the talk considering some replies to the puzzle that treat it as primarily a problem about language. And then I'll consider a kind of response that says, well, maybe part of the problem here is a problem about language, but there's also something to say or learn here about what knowledge is. So maybe the puzzle teaches us something in epistemology too. Okay, so the stuff I'll say there is more speculative, and I'm sort of still kind of wrapping my mind around the right way to think about it. I'm more confident that there's a puzzle than that I have a solution to. But we'll see if you even agree there's a puzzle. So let me start with that. So I'll just frame it as a story. Suppose Bob is a teacher, he has a bunch of students. I'm wondering, which of Bob's students is his favorite? For some weird reason, Bob decides to be super cagey about this question. He doesn't want to tell me directly. He says, he's obviously a philosopher. He says something like this. He says, the set that contains Jane and Ted, that set contains my favorite student, but also a student that isn't even in my top 10. We could even say, you know, the set is like the set of his favorite student and also like the student he dislikes the most. Make it really straight. So let's suppose, you know, he's being honest and I know it, he's transferring knowledge with his speech act here, right? This is sort of, he's telling the truth. I have no reason to think he isn't. So I gain some knowledge from what he says. I can say that I know that Bob's favorite student is either Jane or Ted. that seems right. So this description, if I utter it, this is a sort of self-description of knowledge seems right. I can also, maybe you can think of this as a step of reasoning, maybe you think it just trivially is almost a reformulation of what Bob conveyed to me. Seems like I can think to myself, all right, Bob's favorite student is either Jane or Ted, so if it isn't Jane, it's Ted, right? Seems like pretty unassailable reasoning. We surely do reason like that all the time. If there's nothing flawless about, if that's pretty flawless as it seems, I should also be able to say this, kind of utter this to myself, and it seems true if I do that. I know that if Bob's favorite student isn't Jane, then it's Ted. Plausibly, others can say this too, describing my knowledge state, right? Here I'm just talking about myself. If others say this kind of thing, it looks like they say something true. Looks like that's just another way to say what I said. Modulo this indexical here, basically saying the same thing, right? So if this is true, then surely this is true too. Okay, so far nothing should seem too surprising. That should all seem right. The question I want to ask is, what can Bob say about what I know? Here I want to add a bit to the story. So here's what I'll add. Suppose that it's after all Jane, that's Bob's favorite. So Ted, not even in the top 10, he's the most disappointing student maybe of Bob's, whatever. So here's where I feel like something funny starts to happen. I think Bob could say something like this to a colleague. He can say, my favorite student is Jane, but Seth doesn't know that. Seth does know, however, that my favorite student is either Jane or Ted, right? Because of what he told me. This is what he told me, remember. So he's explaining the situation to a colleague. He says this. I think, what's interesting is maybe if you compare that to if he said this instead. My favorite student is Jane, but Seth doesn't know that. Seth does know, however, that if my favorite student isn't Jane, it's Ted. Remember, Bob's thinking to himself, I can't stand Ted. And yet, here he is saying, oh, Seth knows that if my favorite student isn't Jane, it's Ted. I think that's comparatively marked. Hopefully you agree. If you don't, then this talk might bore you. But I still think there's maybe some interesting stuff here, even if you're iffy on the judgments. So there's this pull. So what's a little puzzling here? So what's the situation? Basically, Bob or anybody in relevantly similar epistemic circumstances to Bob, namely anybody who knows that Bob's favorite is Jane, it's weird. It seems weird for them to use this indicative conditional to say that Seth knows that if Bob's favorite isn't Jane, it's Ted. So why is that? Why is this puzzling? Well, of course, initially we were just saying, look, that's true. Here it is. I said it. It seems fine for me to say. Others can describe me like that. At least others who don't know who Bob's favorite is can say this, and it sounds like they're saying is right. Then from Bob's point of view, like what should Bob think about that conditional? Right? That's kind of the question here. Bob is in a superior epistemic position, and it seems somehow that superior knowledge he has gets in the way of felicitously describing my knowledge state like this. And what's going on? Right, that's the problem. Why is that? If I know this conditional, it's because Bob helped me know it. Why is it that he in particular has trouble describing what I know? Right, that's kind of weird. He gave me this knowledge, and yet he can't say what conditional it is that I in fact know. Here's another way to kind of draw your intuitions out. Suppose you can compare these two questions Bob might be asked. First question: does Seth know that your favorite student is either Jane or Ted? And there it feels like Bob can say, yes, he knows that disjuncture. What if Bob was asked, does Seth know that if your favorite student isn't Jane, it's Ted? That I think is comparatively weird, right? So that question feels like it's based on a mistake. You might get the feeling like it's saying somehow your second choice would be Ted. you know, there's a way of hearing this where it's more like a counterfactual reading of the conditional, where it's like, does Seth know that if your favorite student weren't Jane, it would be Ted? Right? So try to be careful about whether you're hearing, you're kind of, as a charitable speaker, kind of projecting a slightly different interpretation onto the conditional than the one I'm using. Yeah, so here's this asymmetry, and it's sort of the same problem in a different guise. So my super precise question I want to ask here is, what's the deal? Right, this is the big, difficult question. Or more precisely, one way to kind of try to isolate a concrete question here is like, here's a knowledge description, true or false? If it's true, why does it seem false, or at least odd, something weird about Bob's agreeing to it? Or basically anybody in Bob's kind of relevant epistemic position. So if it's true, we have that problem to kind of address. And then if it's false, of course, we seem to have just a really basic problem about ever knowing an indicative conditional where the antecedent is false. It seems like a lot of Iffy, what I'm going to call Iffy knowledge that we characteristically ascribe using indicative conditionals in the complement position. It seems like quite a lot of it that we thought we had, we don't really have, if this is false, because it seemed like a pretty paradigm case of just having an indicative conditional knowledge. So if that doesn't count as indicative knowledge, doesn't count as Iffy knowledge, what does? Right? How do we even have as much as we thought? So that's kind of the problem I want to poke around for the balance of the talk. So I should note some prior art here. This might remind you of Gibbert's slide view case. So Alan Gibbert has this paper, 2 recent theories of conditionals, where he discusses this case. This is sort of famous case from the literature on conditionals. So let me just read it to you. So here's the case. Sly Pete and Mr. Stone are playing poker on a Mississippi riverboat. It's now up to Pete to call or fold. And here Alan has 2 henchmen. His henchman Zach sees Stone's hand, which is quite good, and signals its content to Pete. So Zach only sees Stone's hand, and he sort of secretly signals to Pete, okay, this is what Stone has. So Zach is going to think if Pete called, he won because he used his knowledge. If he called, then he used his knowledge of the other hand to decide, oh, well, if Pete called, it must be that he thinks his hand is better and he knows his hand is better. So if he called, then he won. Alan's other henchman, Jack, sees both hands and sees that Pete's hand is rather low, so that Stone's is the winning hand. So Jack is going to think if Pete called, he lost, right? Because he saw both hands and he saw that Pete's hand was worse. So if Pete called, he's not going to win, he's going to lose, right? So here we have a case where one henchman thinks if Pete called, he won. The other henchman thinks if Pete called, he lost. So the story continues. I know these notes come from my trusted henchmen, but do not know which of them sent which note. So there's an added factor here, which is that sort of Alan gets both of these indicative conditionals, but doesn't know whose is whose. And he uses the knowledge that he gets from these conditionals to conclude that Pete folded. So there's a puzzle here about, well, there's quite a few puzzles that this case raises. A lot of people who hear this case, and sometimes it takes a couple minutes to sort of absorb what's going on. It's a pretty weird case. But if you were able to follow it, you'll see that there's a connection to what I was just talking about, the sort of initial thing I started out with. And Stalmacher kind of puts his finger on it in his recent book. So here's how he draws out the connection between this and the puzzle about Iffy knowledge I started with. It says, each of Alan's henchmen had knowledge of all the facts which they based their conditional claims, and they also knew what they didn't know. that is, for example, Zach knows that he didn't know that he doesn't know Pete's hand, right? The other henchman can see both hands, but Zach can only see Stone's hand, and so on. So each of Alan's henchmen had knowledge of all the facts which they based their conditional claims. They also knew what they didn't know. So it would seem reasonable for Jack to assure Alan in his note that he knew that Pete lost if he called, and for Jack to say that he knew that Pete won if he called. But it would be paradoxical for Alan to report that Jack knew that Pete lost if he called, and Zach knew that Pete won if he called. So it feels like in this case we want to say, Zach should think to himself, yeah, I know. Look, I know Stone isn't going to do anything crazy. I'm telling Stone, I'm signaling to Stone, here's what these other cards look like. So of course, so he's signaling the contents of Stone's hand to Pete. So if Pete called, then he won. That seems like something Zach knows. Given Jack's information, he sees both hands. He thinks if Pete called, he lost. He seems to know that. Of course, the puzzle is, from Alan's point of view, it doesn't seem like he can ascribe these pieces of knowledge to these two individuals. It seems like you're ascribing, so you would be ascribing something of the form, if A, then B, if A, then not B. And you're saying, so like, Jack knows this, and Zach knows this. And since knowledge is factive, since generally we think X knows that P, both presupposes and entails P, it seems like that amounts to endorsing this conditional and its conditional contradiction. So it would, so it feels like Alan is in this funny position. He trusts his henchmen. He thinks they spoke truly, or anyway, didn't make a mistake. He might think that, and he gains information from what they say. Clearly, he does gain information. But he has trouble ascribing the Iffy knowledge to his two henchmen. Because if he does that, it seems like, as Stolnacher notes, that he's doing something paradoxical. Okay, so here's kind of the analogy. Just as Bob has trouble ascribing Iffy knowledge to me in the case described earlier, in part because he knows that the antecedent of the relevant conditional is false. Likewise, Alan has trouble ascribing Iffy knowledge to his henchman because what he says teaches him, somehow, that Pete didn't call, and hence that his henchman's respective indicative conditionals have false antecedents. So that's the analogy to this classic case. Although Alan gains knowledge from the two indicative conditionals he's told, it would be really odd by the end of the story to describe him as knowing either of those indicative conditionals, the conditionals that were used to give him this new knowledge. So, like, he sort of ultimately gains non-Iffy knowledge that he folded. And he gets it via these indicative conditionals, but it seems what's kind of weird is that by the end of the story, it doesn't seem quite right to describe Alan as knowing those two conditionals. So this makes Iffy knowledge look really weird and fragile, like comes and goes, and it disappears as you gain more information. This is sort of mysterious because we're not used to thinking of knowledge as fragile in this kind of way. So, one of my questions anyway, is what's the right way of thinking about this knowledge, and I'll talk about it. So as I said at the beginning, I want to talk about basically two sorts of attitudes you can have toward the puzzle. One is, you might call it like linguistic response, and there might be many different responses sort of falling under this heading. And here the thought is, well, let's just try to explain the problem as one, basically in semantics or pragmatics. It's basically a problem about language, something about presupposition or context sensitivity. It's not really anything about knowledge per se. It's just this is a puzzle about how we're talking about knowledge. So that, I'll call that a linguistic kind of response. And then there's a more, so according to this response, our problem has lessons to teach about how conditionals maybe interact with attitude environments. It maybe doesn't teach us anything special in epistemology. And then there's the view that, no, maybe part of the problem here is that we also need to sort of rethink some of our assumptions in epistemology. Maybe we need to recognize Iffy knowledge as epistemically distinctive in a certain sense. So one kind of idea I'll try to develop is that it's a species of what you might call non-monotonic knowledge. So the thought being, it's like almost a kind of knowledge, and this is kind of rough, I'll try to make this more precise as I go, that you can lose upon strictly gaining information. So you can know an indicative conditional, strictly gain knowledge, and yet cease to know the indicative conditional under the impact of gaining more information. We're not used to knowledge as being like that. We're used to thinking, no, knowledge is sort of cumulative. Of course, there's cases where you gain knowledge that sort of undermines evidence for other things you believe, and so you cease to know what you used to know. That's a different kind of case. Okay, so so on this epistemological response, you still might think, well, there's plenty of cool stuff happening in semantics and pragmatics here too. So it's not that language is relevant to the problem. It's just that part of our response should include maybe recognizing Iffy knowledge as epistemically distinct. So I kind of lean towards this response, and I'll try to describe why and sort of what kind of picture of it I have in mind. But let me first talk more about this sort of linguistic response. This is a more deflationary, in a sense, way of responding to the puzzle. So maybe this has a presumptive status. We should sort of make sure that this is not completely adequate. Okay, so here's a natural first thought. The problem isn't something, again, it's nothing special in epistemology. Rather, the problem is to do with the language used to describe the states. Let's start with the thought that their presuppositional properties, in particular, are to blame. Presuppositional properties of some of our target sentences, like 5 on the handout. So we know the verb knows is factive, presupposes its complement. And indicative conditionals also are thought to come with certain kinds of presuppositions. In particular, they're standardly thought to presuppose that their antecedents are epistemically possible. So plausibly, one could claim that presupposition figures in this kind of ascription in at least 2 ways. First, you might think, well, first of all, the whole ascription, the whole sentence, presupposes the embedded indicative conditional. This follows from the more general thought that S knows that P presupposes P. So here P just happens to be an indicative conditional. Second, plausibly, the whole thing presupposes that the antecedent of the embedded conditional is epistemically possible. So, usually if you just said this indicative conditional by itself, you would presuppose that it might be that Bob's favorite isn't Jane. And it looks like when you put this indicative conditional under knows, that presupposition kind of projects through to the whole ascription. So plausibly, presupposition figures in this knowledge description in those 2 ways. So here's a quick way of seeing it. But being rough without use and mention. So the knowledge description presupposes the conditional and also this epistemic possibility claim. Okay, if that's right, then you might try saying, look, it's infelicitous for Bob to utter the knowledge description because it would convey that Bob endorses these presuppositions. But he doesn't. So the problem is really that presuppositions are getting in the way of Bob's being able to describe my knowledge state. So maybe, right, yeah. Okay. So I've taken on this kind of view, I do have the relevant Iffy knowledge, the problem is that the presuppositions of the sentence get in the way of Bob's being able to felicitously describe the knowledge to you. So this view actually, it's pretty subtle working this out exactly. Because there are subtleties here about exactly what it is that Bob is presupposing when he presupposes these two things. Bracketing that, I think this view, on the face of it, is still at least a little surprising. Because it's still the case that effectively Bob gives me knowledge that he cannot ascribe to me. So I have Iffy knowledge, and yet it's interesting, it's sort of interesting that unfortunately for Bob, the ascription has presuppositions that he doesn't want to endorse. It's kind of odd though to think, well, it's saying something true, and yet it presupposes some things that Bob doesn't want to presuppose. In any case, it seems like we can get the basic problem going without no's and certain of the presuppositional distractions it creates. So let me consider a variation. Suppose we had Bob say this instead. Bob thinks that my favorite student is either Jane or Ted, and he's right. Seems okay to me. When you frame the knowledge disjunctively, seems okay. And then the contrast is meant to be with this kind of way of this discourse. Seth thinks that if my favorite student isn't Jane, it's Ted. And he's right. Then I think it's not any better, really, than the knowledge description earlier, out of Bob's mouth. At least there does seem to be a contrast here. And so we still have a problem explaining why that is. Why is there this contrast? I mean, you really want to internalize this thought that, look, yeah, let's run with the thought that, yes, I have some kind of Iffy knowledge, but granted that the sentence also has certain presuppositions that are problematic, maybe if Bob kind of signals that he endorses those presuppositions, but I have this Iffy knowledge. If you accept that, I have this Iffy knowledge, and Bob recognizes that, it feels like he ought to be able to say this. I'm in this Iffy knowledge state, which is a certain kind of belief state, state of believing a certain conditional, and it's constituting knowledge. Bob's saying I have this belief, and I'm right. So why does he have trouble with that? Maybe this is the right response, and I think maybe some people might disagree here, but let me just put this idea out there. One thought is that the problem is that Bob thinks I get things wrong in endorsing the Iffy thought that I endorse. There's get things wrong is not very precise, and that's on purpose, and we're trying to sort of grope onto what exactly is supposed to be the problem with what I think, according to Bob. But there's some way in which my thinking could be improved. And in respect of this indicative conditional, Bob's point of view is, no, you could be doing better doxastically or epistemically. Bob is not disposed to say, I'm doing well, what I think is right, something along those lines. And it's not that Bob could think to himself, yeah, I told Seth that, basically I told him that my favorite student is either Jane or Ted, so I don't blame him. Of course he thinks that if it isn't Jane, then it's Ted. The issue is just how, so Bob's going to grant that, I'm being as epistemically responsible as anyone. He's not going to think I've made a flaw in my reasoning, something like that. That's not the issue. Let's just agree that he thinks I'm perfectly rational in thinking what I think. The question is really just about how does Bob assess what I think? Does he think what I'm thinking is right? Or does he think there's some problem there? It seems like he thinks there's some problem there because there's this asymmetry here. And if that's right, it kind of leaves the puzzle where it was. What is this Iffy knowledge I claim to have, and do I in fact have it? Another kind of linguistic approach you might take. So I think there's a lot more to say here. I mean, you know, when we claim that Bob presupposes that it might be that Bob's favorite student is Jane, like what is that presupposition? Is it a presupposition about what's epistemically possible for Bob? Is it about what's epistemically possible for Seth? Some kind of weird mixture? We haven't really said that. Why should, if this knowledge description, you know, if this epistemic possibility claim concerns what Bob knows, why should it be a presupposition of this knowledge description? Why should the knowledge description presuppose something about what Bob knows, right? So there are already like many questions here about like, well, how does this theory even, can we even kind of give a first pass version of it that coheres? So I was like, granting that we could, but I still think there are problems there, but I'm going to skip over them because of time. I'll consider now another kind of linguistic approach, which is to say something context sensitivity, right? That's the theory, right? So here's the sort of like, here's how you might get into this like sort of mood. You might say, well, look, it seems like that might not be a crazy idea. It's good for me to say, I know that if Bob's favorite student isn't Jane, it's Ted. It's bad for Bob to say, Seth knows that if Bob's favorite student isn't Jane, it's Ted. Maybe the fact is that, maybe the issue is that these are expressing different things owing to some context sensitivity in the embedded indicative conditional. So they're not, they're just not saying the same thing. So it's okay to end up with the view that maybe this says something false out of Bob's mouth owing to his occupying a different context. This is something true owing to it coming out of my mouth in my context. So even though they look like they should be expressing the same thing, the thought is maybe they don't owing to context sensitivity. So initial problem is just what is the contextualist theory that's supposed to make this work? I actually don't know any contextualist theory of negative conditionals that would is even sort of on the face of it plausible here. But I might not be thinking creatively enough, so I just very much welcome proposals on this score if people sort of find this kind of approach attractive. I think one question that strikes me about this basic idea, however it's developed, is that, you know, it has to be a quite constrained kind of context sensitivity. So it's not just, oh, you know, indicative conditionals are super contextually flexible. They can just pick up on bodies of knowledge all day, and like maybe the subject of the description shifts the body of knowledge, and so you know, this is really talking about, you know, maybe, you know, a thought, you know, a standard thought is that indicative conditionals are restricted epistemic modal claims, and maybe the relevant epistemic modality is fixed here by the subject contextually. That could be a kind of view you might have. But you know, if you go in for a view like that, one thing to point out is just that you really have to be constrained in how you postulate this, because you know the natural question here is when you're faced with various ways to resolve the putative context sensitivity in Bob's sentence, why do you gravitate towards a way of resolving the context sensitivity that renders the sentence anomalous? I mean, evidently there's some way of resolving the context sensitivity that renders the sentence true. So like, why, you know, so we don't want to say indicative conditionals are massively contextually flexible, since this just seems like a counterexample to that claim. If they are, then it ought to be that in this description out of Bob's mouth, the if claim ought to be able to express whatever it is that I'm describing to myself here. So it can't be that kind of super flexible contextualist theory. Then you can, of course, have a less flexible contextualist theory that doesn't allow you that kind of freedom. I just don't know what the theory would be. So I just wanted to flag that sort of direction, not claiming I've refuted that kind of approach, but just sort of indicating what has to be done there. While the topic of context sensitivity is on the table, it's worth noting that various contextual pragmatic requirements that have been postulated for indicative conditionals don't trivially generalize to embedded indicative conditionals, which is really the main core of the puzzle here. I feel like it's worth sort of talking through this because it'll maybe put on the table some machinery that we could use later. So consider, for example, the semantics and pragmatics for indicative conditionals that Stalmacher offered in various papers. Here's the idea. Indicative conditionals are interpreted relative to a contextually supplied selection function, takes a world and a sentence to a possible world. So you have this function and you input a world and a sentence and it outputs a world. And the world that you get is a world that makes the sentence true and which is otherwise minimally different from W. Some formal constraints. It's not important to go through them, but people, assuming are basically familiar with this kind of idea. Here's a kind of semantic clause in your modal logic for conditionals. So it would look like that. So that's the kind of abstract formal semantics. And then Stalmacher, when it comes to indicative conditionals, proposes that our understanding of indicative conditionals is constrained on the pragmatic side in two ways. First, the selection function. This is, so yeah, maybe I didn't talk through this enough. So of course, you were getting the world. So basically, if phi then psi is true to the world, just in case, the nearest world, or the world minimally different from the world you started from, where phi is true, is one where psi is true. So sort of nearness semantics for the condition. So then Stalmacher proposes that in the pragmatics, what separates indicative conditionals from counterfactual conditionals is a constraint on how the selection function picks out its world. So he says, when it comes to indicatives, you need to select, there's this requirement that the selection function select a world from among the possibilities left open in the conversation. So let's call that the context set. That's his jargon for it. So there's this requirement that when you say if phi then psi, there have to be phi possibilities open in your conversation. And that sort of seems intuitively right. If you say, if Oswald didn't shoot Kennedy, someone else did, you seem to be presupposing it's possible that Oswald didn't shoot Kennedy. Whereas if you use the counterfactual, if Oswald hadn't shot Kennedy, someone else did, you're not presupposing that that antecedent is open. On the contrary, it seems like you're presupposing it isn't open. So that's his idea about, that's the first pragmatic constraint he proposes. Second kind of suggestion he makes in more recent work is that indicative conditionals have a distinctive sort of force. So the indicative conditional, the selection function needs to choose from among the possibilities left open by the context set. But also, it's not merely that when you utter indicative conditional, you're adding a proposition to the common ground and eliminating possibilities incompatible with the conditional proposition. In his more recent work, he proposes that really what you're doing is proposing to adjust the context in some way or other to make what the indicative conditional says true. So the thought is, if you're in a context where the antecedent isn't regarded as a live possibility, then the indicative conditional is understood as a proposal to change the context in such a way as to add some possibilities, so that the indicative conditional can then be true relative to the context as adjusted. So that's a much newer idea that still being scrutinized in the literature. This is a very old idea. It's from the 70s at least. This idea that, well, basically the first constraint is a way of building into the semantics, pragmatics, the idea that if phi then psi, indicative, presupposes possibly phi. That's another way of, this is just like, you can think of it as a way of capturing that idea. And then this is like a newer idea about the force of indicative conditionals. Gibbard motivates it actually partly by arguing that if you have that idea, you can give an account of the sly P case. I'm not going to go through his way of doing that. All I want to note is this, is that neither of these constraints plausibly apply in any generality to embedded indicative conditionals. So even if you think these are right, so my kind of big picture lesson here is, yeah, you might have like non-trivial, interesting, pragmatic constraints on indicative conditionals unembedded, but and you might think those are useful to explain certain phenomena, and like Stalnaker does think they're useful for explaining this sly P case. But whether these obtain, it's not at all clear whether either of these apply in any generality when we're talking about indicative conditionals embedded. And indeed, I think they don't apply in generality. So here's a simple case to see why that's so. Suppose we're waiting for Bill to arrive at our cafe for coffee. Bill glances into our cafe, but he fails to spot us. He then goes looking for us in the cafe across the street. So we're sort of watching. He looks in quickly, doesn't see us, and then turns and crosses the street, and we see him like look into the other cafe. And you're wondering, like, well, why is Bill doing that? And I say, well, I told him we'd be in this cafe or that one. So Bill thinks that if we're not at this cafe, we're at the one across the street. So what's the lesson? The lesson is, I can say that it's fine. When I say that, I'm not presupposing that our context leaves open possibilities where we're not in the cafe we're in, right? It's obvious to us we're in this cafe. I'm not like suddenly treating it as, oh, maybe we're not in this cafe. Maybe we're across the street after all. So when I say Bill thinks, I'm not, the presupposition associated with the indicative conditional is not being inherited by the entire description. This is a very simple point. So, the point is, even if we thought these kinds of constraints were useful for explaining related puzzles like the sly P case, it's not at all clear how, one has to argue that these constraints apply to indicatives embedded in some interesting way. Now, of course, there is an important difference here with this example. I say thinks. Thinks is not factive. And neither is believes. Maybe something like these pragmatic requirements of Stalnaker's apply when it comes to indicatives embedded under factive attitude verbs like knows. That would require some argument. It's not obvious why they should apply in such cases, but you could make that claim. In any case, I've already suggested the puzzle we've got. You can get it going without using the word knows. So I don't think this is going to ultimately be a path for a solution. Okay, so we'll keep going. Let me turn now to this epistemological response, and I'll just sort of sketch a picture. Probably be unsatisfying in the time I have left, but I'll sort of try to do my best. So here's a kind of picture you might have of the situation. To know that if phi then psi, where this is indicative, you have to know possibly phi. That would be, you might think, that is not unconnected to the standard view that this presupposes possibly phi. You might think that's right. To really know an indicative conditional, you also have to know that the antecedent is epistemically possible. To know that the antecedent is epistemically possible, you have to believe it's epistemically possible. You have to believe it might be that phi. Now, here's the view that I want to sort of add to the mix that sort of changes the shape of the issue. So I want to consider the idea that believing it might be that phi isn't to believe true a proposition. It's to be in a belief state that leaves phi open. So let me give a simple picture of this. Suppose we have a set of, consider like model state of belief, a set of belief worlds, ways the world might be according to what I believe. A sort of standard picture of the situation would just look like this. What is it to believe it might be the phi? Well, what is it to believe anything? It's just for the proposition to be true throughout your belief worlds. It's for your belief worlds to be a subset of the proposition that you believe. That's a standard idea, and at least if you're theorizing the possible worlds, theorizing about attitudes using possible worlds, we're familiar with this idea since Hintika. But I want to suggest this isn't the right picture to have in mind when we're talking about epistemic possibility. Shouldn't think of epistemic possibility as when you say it might be raining, or it might be that Bob's favorite isn't Jane. You're not believing true proposition. You're not holding that the world is a certain way rather than another. You're just in a belief state that leaves phi open. So a better picture of what it is to believe might phi is something more like this. It's just, so notice there's no proposition that might phi here. It's just phi. There's your belief worlds and phi. And your belief worlds, and counting as believing that it might be that phi is just to leave open some phi worlds. It's not for something to be true throughout your belief worlds. Now, I think you need a more elaborate picture than just that, but this is close enough, I think, to get the gist of the idea I want to suggest. So, the thought is, let's go with this. Suppose we have this picture of what it is to believe something might be the case. I've argued for this kind of picture in a whole bunch of papers. Now you might think, okay, so there's this kind of belief state that isn't factual in a certain sense, in that it's not an attitude towards the way the world is. To believe it might be raining is just for your belief state to have a certain global property. Now you might make this further claim. Well, this aspect of your belief state, that can constitute knowledge. That's interesting if right, because it's a kind of knowledge that isn't a relation to a true proposition. Right? It's not that you have to be attitude related to something true to potentially have this kind of knowledge, because it isn't, believing it might be that phi, it just isn't an attitude towards the proposition that it might be that phi at all. So you might have this picture of this kind of belief, and then say this kind of state can constitute knowledge. And as I said, it's sort of surprising since it entails the possibility of knowledge in the absence of truth known. And it's surprising also because this would be a sort of non-persistent or non-monotonic knowledge, in that your view about what you know about what might be the case can change as you strictly gain information. Of course, you're believing might phi, so your belief state looks like this, but then you might strictly gain information. Maybe your belief state sort of eliminates possibilities, gets smaller, and maybe it eliminates all the possibilities where phi is the case. If so, then you strictly gain information, but you lose the belief that it might be that phi. And that's not ceasing to believe a proposition, because believing might be that phi isn't believing a proposition in the first place on this picture. So the kind of thought is, at T1, I know that Bob's favorite might be Ted. At T2, I gain some information. I learn that Bob's favorite is not Ted. I cease to know that Bob's favorite might be Ted. And I cease to know that anybody else knows that. So this is the kind of picture of the dynamics I'm imagining. At a certain point in time, you have the view that you know that Bob's favorite might be Ted. So when Bob just tells me what he initially says to me, I take myself to know that Bob's favorite might be Ted. Later, if I discover from Bob or somebody else that, in fact, Bob's favorite is Jane, I then know that Bob's favorite is not Ted. I cease to know, it's not the case that I know that Bob's favorite might be Ted. Also, from my point of view, no one else knows that it might be the case. Why is that? Well, if you have the view that you know not phi, then it's very hard to think that anyone else knows that it might be that phi. It feels like there's a tension there, right? Because if you grant that others know that it might be that phi, then it seems like you should think you know it might be that phi, but you know that not phi. Surely you don't know that Bob's favorite isn't Ted and it might be Ted. that doesn't even make sense. You can't know that it isn't Ted and it might be that Ted. It might be that Ted is Bob's favorite. So in this picture, as you view yourself as knowing more, you view others as knowing less about what's epistemically possible. This is the kind of weird upshot of this way of thinking about what it is to believe something's epistemically possible. You might come at it from another ways. Suppose I know that it might be raining, and I know that you know it might be raining. Now suppose I, and only I, gain information and learn that it isn't raining. It looks like, from my new epistemic viewpoint, it won't seem quite right for me to say that you know that it might be raining, for that implies that I think it might be raining, and I don't think it might be raining. I think that it isn't raining. I gotta skip that part. So the perhaps surprising ideal this leads to is that one's view about what oneself and what others know, at least when it comes to epistemic or Iffy knowledge, is not purely factual in character. And this is actually very much in the spirit of the view Gibbard already tentatively endorsed in this 1981 paper where the Sly-Pete case comes up. It's also very much in the spirit of Adams. So, both of these theorists, Adams especially was interested in the connection between indicative conditionals and the corresponding conditional probabilities. So famously, we know from Lewis that it's pretty hard. So there's this attractive idea that, well, believing in indicative conditional is having appropriately high conditional credence. To believe if A, if I, then psi is to have in some sense highish credence in psi given phi. Lewis showed that it's really hard to find a proposition that actually has that that systematically is associated with that conditional credence. This is the triviality results. So for that reason, many people sort of got worried about whether indicative conditionals have truth conditions, because we couldn't find a proposition that could be associated with the kind of probability that seemed like the right probability to associate it with it. And so Gibbard, sort of following Adams, was like, well, it's just the wrong way to think about it. Don't think of indicative conditionals as corresponding to ways the world is. It's not that you believe a proposition when you believe in indicative conditional. And that's the direction I'm going in here too. To believe in indicative conditional is to be in a certain kind of, is for your belief state to have a certain kind of global property that isn't reducible to a way the world is throughout your belief worlds. It's a more complex property than that. And the issue is that when you put things like indicative conditionals or epistemic models under knowledge operators, the knowledge claim itself inherits the non-factual character of the stuff that it embeds, owing to the factivity of knowledge. That's the kind of picture I want to suggest. So, so when I think about your epistemic state, I don't regard it as just another feature of the world, like a factual property of the world, just like the weather or something like that. My view about what you do or don't know might be constrained by my view about features of my own epistemic state, features that are global in character. If I take my epistemic state to exclude rain possibilities, for instance, I can't credit you with knowledge that it might be raining. I can't say that the feature of your belief state, which consists in its leaving open rain possibilities, constitutes knowledge. Okay, I'll wrap up. I could perhaps do that if I took myself to have less knowledge than I in fact do, but I can't think you know it might be raining if I know that it isn't raining. It seems like my knowledge precludes your knowledge. So I've talked mostly about epistemic possibility, knowing epistemic possibility, and kind of connected it to indicative conditionals through this entailment. Plausibly, Iffy knowledge is just non-factual on its own, and for the kinds of reasons I sketched, going back to Adams and Gibbard. Knowing if phi then psi is non-monotonic, not only because it entails might phi, but because it requires being in a non-monotonic state of knowing. Well, because it corresponds to this sort of global property. So here, let me just draw a quick picture and I'll stop. So here I contrasted these two ways of thinking about what it is to believe something might be the case. This picture is saying, oh, that's believing a proposition. This picture is saying, no, it's not, it's something else. You could have the same picture for conditionals. the same kind of contrast. And this is sort of the thing I want to say. Believing if phi then psi, here's the traditional kind of propositional picture of it. But you might have a picture of it that looks more like this, where what you're saying is your belief state is such that if it were updatable, if you were to update it, if you were by adding phi, you would end up in a sort of subregion where psi is true throughout. And that's a kind of global property belief state that doesn't correspond to just believing a proposition. And the claim is that this kind of state of belief can constitute knowledge. And it's not a knowledge state that consists in being in some attitude relation to a proposition. Okay, so going back to our question, is this true or false? I want to say the knowledge description is not fully factual, so a better question to ask is, what is it to believe the knowledge description? To believe that is partly to believe the embedded conditional, and to think that one so believing constitutes knowledge. The state of believing the conditional is not a state of believing true proposition, rather it's a complex global property of the state, one that you can lose upon strict gain of information. Okay, but this is all admittedly very iffy, so we'll stop there. Thanks.
Entonces, vamos a abrir la sesión a preguntas y respuestas. Vamos a empezar con estudiantes. Les recuerdo otra vez que pueden hacer las preguntas en español o en inglés. Además, las pueden hacer por escrito si quieren, yo las leo o yo las traduzco, lo que sea necesario para que participen. ¿Ok? Entonces, por favor, levanten sus manos para que las pueda apuntar y luego empezamos a abrir preguntas. ¿Ok? Bueno, déjame ponerme también, cambiar de anteojos. Híjole, yo no sé qué es peor. Porque así puedo escribir, pero no puedo ver quiénes son.
Hay una nueva tecnología, se llaman lentes bifocales.
Sí, pero también hay un viejo pecado que se llama la vanidad. Y... ¿Alguien más por ahí? ¿Alguien más de nuestros queridos estudiantes? Ok, pues bueno, como estamos estudiantes para empezar, vamos a empezar con Ricardo. Ya pueden bajar sus manos.
Yeah, so I have to confess that I had a hard time getting in the mood where it's infelicitous for Bob to say that Seth knows that if it's not Jane, it's Seth. But you know, if I try hard and I get in the mood where that's infelicitous, it also starts feeling felicitous for Bob to say Seth knows that it's either Jane or Ted. And perhaps that's because I think, and I'm not sure about this, but I think that this is some sort of principle of knowledge that, you know, if S knows that P and S can infer Q from P in a, you know, in a responsible way, then S knows that Q. So I think, you know, if Bob gets to say Seth knows that it's either Jane or Ted, and let's say Bob knows that you have performed the inference from it's either Jane or Ted to if it's not Jane or Ted, then it just feels to me that Bob can very easily say Seth knows that if it's not Jane, it's Ted. So this is not a proof of anything. Maybe it proves that your puzzle it's more pressing than we thought because it clashes with this with this principle. You know, that it's not a P and it's can infer Q from P, then it's not a Q. So I don't know. That will be.
So just to get clear on your judgment, so it was that. So your first judgment was it's fine for Bob to say this.
I don't know why would Bob want to say something like that, but it certainly doesn't feel infelicitous for me.
Like these are on par. Like if Bob were to say, let's just replace the I. I mean, I guess that because what's helpful is to have a contrast. So we have to see. So do I have a slide that has? I don't think I do. Yeah, no, I think I do. Yeah, this So was your judgment that these are basically equally used? Just to get clear on that.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
And also, it's worth noting that if someone says it's either Jane or Ted, doesn't it have to be also an open possibility that it's either?
Yes.
Well, I guess this is an empirical question. Like, of course, when you just utter the disjunction alone, that sounds right. I guess my judgment is that there's a contrast between these. I mean, but it's, I'm not here to tell you what your judgment should be. So maybe I should just ask. So like, does anyone get this contrast at all?
Yeah, I do get it.
Okay. Yeah, can you just raise your hand if you do get it? Okay.
Yeah, I do not. So I actually am sympathetic
Interesting.
with the, I think at the end it depends on closure. It depends on whether you take the equivalence between disjunction and the conditional in classical logic seriously.
I wouldn't say that, because this is really like about this is trying to get a grip on what the language means in the first place, and like whether we should reason about if and or classically, for instance. Like that's like we have, of course, we have classical frameworks where that inference is valid and others where it's not. And the question just is like, well, as far as natural language goes, how do things unfold, right? And that's supposed to be the kind of case where we just have to consider a bunch of data and ask like, well, which patterns seem valid, which don't? What are our judgments about this? So it would be problematic to like project the theory into your judgments here, since that would get things in the reverse order, right? Like we're not, we're just asking like, well, how do we judge these sentences? And then we try to define a semantics and a logic for them that gets the predictions that match our judgments.
Well, but you're asking for something that
Is this your question or?
Yeah, no, yeah.
Okay,
I can shut up because
No. Finish? Well, the first one, yes.
Okay, anyway, yeah, you were next, so it's okay.
Okay, you can jump in since I didn't say that. My concern is, of course, you're asking for us to do something that is not so easy to do, because you're so, oh, look, ignore all you know, right? Try to hear this as...
No.
I don't know how to do it, right?
Well, no, but I mean, I'm saying, you know, of course, you know, suppose you're a linguist and you're trying to do the semantics from like modal verbs, right? Now, like your empirical work there and like your understanding of like which judgments need to be validated by your semantics might be tainted if you've done too much modal logic, right? Because you're gonna accidentally project theory into a place where, you know, what you should just be doing is asking speakers like, well, how do you judge this? So like, so yeah, if you find that hard to do because, you know, you've done a lot of logic, then I sympathize with that.
No, it's not hard.
But I don't think there's a fundamental methodological problem here. I'm just applying the usual methodology that's used.
Yeah, no, but my point is, look, of course, if you're a classical logician, you think there might be something odd. I think if you're not...
No, I don't agree with that. So classical logic, you just define connectives that are stipulated what they mean.
That's right. And if
So
you
classical logic has nothing to do with this.
well, if you think that the condition
Okay, well,
of
that's-
language has nothing to do with classical logic, fine.
Well, I mean, it's just an open question. Like that's a completely open question. Of course, we have this classical semantics, like we define these operators, you know, wedge and v and so on, and they behave as we stipulate, or behaves as we find it in the wild. You know, we just have to figure out. You know, many theories doubt that or strictly expresses Boolean disjunction. Of course, there's many theories of conditional. I mean, so I think it's slightly misleading to say like, well, it's just like, do you like classical logic or not? Like, I love classical logic, but I don't think. Yes.
We still have.
Okay, I'm sorry if I misunderstood.
Okay, just a quick follow-up.
Yeah.
I think that at the very least we can concede that there are some contexts where Bob knows that that Jane is his favorite student, and yet he gets to utter Seth knows that if it's not Jane, it's Ted. So what about this case? So the case starts just like your case. So Bob gets to say, Seth knows that it's either Jane or Ted. And let's say Seth doesn't know much classical logic, so Bob teaches the truth tables for the disjunction and walks Seth through it, and then points out that, look, the line where it's not Jane, or where it's Jane is false and instead it's true, it's a line where the disjunction is true. So it seems like Bob can teach Seth right there that it's true that if it's not Jane, it's Ted. In that context, it seems pretty fine to me for Bob to say, look, Seth, you know now that if it's not Jane, it's Ted. If you construct the context with enough detail, it just doesn't sound odd to me at all.
Okay.
The knowledge attribution, which is not to say that there's not a puzzle, because if there are contexts where it's odd to say that, then you still have a case. But at the list, I think it's worth thinking that there are many contexts where it's fine.
No, that's a great thought. I mean, so that would be, I agree, that would be useful. I wouldn't be surprised at all if there are cases where you can like set up the context where there's less of a contrast, although evidently some people don't have a contrast. Evidently many people do, so I'm relieved to see that. So there's still a puzzle about why there should be a divergence in judgment. Even if you think that the judgments aren't uniform, why is there divergence among competent speakers? That's puzzling. But it's tricky. I mean, I'd also agree that basically any utterance is fine with enough context rigging. I mean, you can say utter contradictions, things that look like contradictions and they sound fine. Like if I say, Judy Thompson is this famously abrasive philosopher, right? But she was really nice, like one-on-one. And when I was coming up as a grad student, I feel like you can say, somebody says, is Judy nice? You can say, no, she is and she isn't. Now, like, on the face of it, that looks like a contradiction. Should we go back to our semantics and say, okay, so contradictions are actually not semantically anomalous? No, you should explain the data in some other way. So, like, that's just to illustrate the point that I agree that with enough contextual rigging, you can make it okay. But there's also true that you can make almost anything okay with enough contextual rigging. And then the question is just like, what's the default case that the semantics should what should we want our semantics to do as a default, as it were? And like, what's something that, we should think of as requiring special treatment? Like, presumably, she's nice and she isn't. Well, that's probably not really a contradiction. There's probably some covert material, blah, blah, blah. We'll like say something to make that problem go away. It's not really a true contradiction. So I guess I'd be attracted, of course, I would be, like, towards a theory that would regard the cases where it's okay as sort of leaning on the particulars of the context you were setting up and wanting the default case to predict the asymmetry. But maybe I should reconsider that if the judgments aren't as uniform as you might expect on the theory. So, thanks.
Rodrigo. It's more or less related with that last point. Apart from considering a contextualist view, why don't you consider a relativist view along the line of McFarland?
Yeah.
That way,
Right.
the sentence will not be anomalous since it's an invariant test.
Yeah.
What's relativist truth now?
Yeah, no, that's a great idea. It was mostly just like space considerations that I didn't try to get into that theory in detail. But that's an obvious kind of view worth considering, and I should be required to knock it out before I proceed. So, and on the face of it, it looks very relativist friendly if you have these judgments. I mean, because it just looks like, well, all right, relative to Bob, I don't know. Relative to me, I do. Relative to others who are in a similar position, I do. Yeah, I mean, I guess I have more worries of the foundational character about relativist views. That's why I didn't really pause to work out a version of that, but totally worth doing. I haven't really said anything to refute that kind of view. It would take me some non-trivial time to do that. So it's a very good thought. Yeah. So that's another absolute contender.
Eduardo Garcia.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. It puzzled me a lot, so I think I was just trying to defend Bob all along. I mean, Stanley all along, you're Bob. So let me see if this is, if I got it, you did sort of implicitly consider the linguistic response. And in the end, your main reason against it is that the constraints on indicative conditionals do not generally apply. And you have another example where what would count as an explanation here would not work. That said, I think there's a couple of pieces of evidence that suggest that the linguistic account is at least not clearly mistaken. So
good, yeah.
One piece of evidence is that if you shift the order of those assertions, you don't get the feeling of infelicity. So if you say first Seth, well, if Bob says first, Seth does know, however, that if my favorite is Jane, it's Ted, and then adds my favorite student is Jane, but Seth doesn't know that, there's nothing infelicitous. So if the first assertion is the one that you're calling infelicitous.
Oh, like, so is the context one where, so Bob's talking to a colleague.
And the first thing he says is the last thing.
And he just says this.
Yeah.
So get rid of the however. So,
yeah.
So you think Bob can say that to a colleague?
Happily. And then add my favorite student is Jane, but Seth doesn't know that. And if that is true, then that suggests that it's clearly a pragmatic linguistic thing, because it would just be very weird that it's an epistemic thing, but you can felicitously say it in one context, and then it's just not felicitous after the direct assertion. So that's one piece of evidence. Then what would explain for that phenomenon? If you go to your the conditions on indicative conditionals that come from Stanley, and then you need, when you have the indicative conditional, you need to keep open the possibility of the antecedent, right? That would explain why it's so weird here. So if the first assertion is my favorite student is Jane, that already excludes the possibility that it's not Jane.
Yes, that's right.
And then you cannot say, Seth does know, however, that if my favorite student isn't Jane,
good.
I'm not leaving that open, so that's weird, and that's why it's not felicitous.
Right.
So then we go to your objection to those conditions, those restrictions. Can you go ahead to the Bill example at the cafe?
Yeah, I want to ask you about your judgments here, though.
Yeah.
Well, can we do that first? So
Sure.
I'm surprised. So you do get the contrast, and yet you would be okay with Bob just saying this discourse initial, like,
yes.
Hey, colleague, Seth knows. So that, even though Bob freaking hates it, right?
I know.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. That's fascinating. So I don't have that judgment about the case, sadly.
Without Bob saying anything, like without him telling the colleague, my favorite student is Jane, just the very first thing that Bob says is, hey, Seth knows that if my favorite student isn't Jane, it's Ted.
Really? But like,
I'm
okay with the disjunctive ascription.
Yeah.
But like, what's weird is like picturing Bob as thinking he knows this indicative conditional. But of course, like, if like Bob should, yeah, I mean, part of it maybe is like, so some of the issue here I think is connected to the relation between indicatives and counterfactuals. Like,
yeah,
you know, if Bob were thinking to himself, well, if my favorite student weren't Jane, who would it be? Like, suppose Jane sort of, we consider the nearest world where there's no Jane.
It wouldn't be Ted.
Definitely wouldn't be Ted.
Sure.
So that's what, part of that is like, I sort of feel like our understanding of indicatives is connected to that.
I see you're going to, the reason why I think it's felicitous is because I'm not adding as part of the presuppositions of the conversation that he hates Ted. It's just, this is something that Bob privately knows, but he's not telling that to the colleagues. So the
Okay.
whole conversation is only him directly saying, Seth knows that if it's not Jane, it's that.
Okay. Okay, let's go on to the, so what were you?
The bill on the cafe one.
Oh, cafe. Yeah, okay. Oh, too many slides. Did I pass it?
I think it was before.
Yeah, oh, here's coming.
Yeah, it's right after this, I think. Sure, so, thing is, it is already, so, one important difference between this case and the other one is that what is being said is you're using the word, you're ascribing a thought, you're not ascribing knowledge. So Bill thinks that if we're not at this cafe, we're not at the one, we're at the one across.
Yeah.
Why is that an important difference? Because this is what I would say. When you use things, when you ascribe a thought, you're directly creating a context that's only concerned with Bill's behavior and explaining Bill's behavior and Bill's thoughts and attitudes. Whatever it is that, let's say it's Carmen and me at the cafe, whatever it is that we know is irrelevant or might be irrelevant for that purpose. The presupposition that we are at this cafe is irrelevant for that purpose. It's not included in the context set of the conversation that is aiming at explaining Bill's behavior. So that's why there's nothing weird there. Now, if you change things for no's, you get the same weird result as before. Why? Because knowledge is factive. So if you ascribe knowledge, then that presupposition is already inside that context, and then you get the clash.
Right, and then what do you think is going on with the, like, X believes if A then B and he's right kind of case? Yeah.
That he's right. That is what makes.
Oh, so you think, so is there, do you not get an asymmetry here?
Yeah, but the problem is and he's right. So that would make reintroduces the factive part. So that was before you.
So your thought is that when I say this, I'm kind of attempting to add the indicative conditional to the context or something? Why is that a problem? Well, like, here's what's puzzling to me. I'm just trying to model get a handle on your judgments, because you were saying earlier that it would be okay for Bob to say.
Let me think about this. Yeah, go ahead.
Don't think too hard, because it's supposed to be your judgments. So, it doesn't. Oh yeah, according to.
Yeah.
It's so easy to do that, I think, in this area, and that's why it's hard to like theorize, because we're so familiar with all these theories and how things should work according to them. Earlier we were saying, you think Bob can say to his colleague, Seth knows that if my favorite student isn't Jane, it's Ted. But you were saying that there's a contrast here. But I'm surprised that if you agree there's a contrast here, that you're okay with Bob saying the knowledge description, since that should also be, in effect, a way of like adding this indicative to the common ground conversation.
I need to think a lot more what I think about this, but the only thing I can say is that my judgments were concerning the relation of this kind of assertion with a prior assertion directly saying my favorite student is blah. It just seemed to me that there was this kind of dynamic felicity depending on which one I see first.
Good, okay.
But we need to move on.
Okay, thanks. Thanks a lot.
Jeff?
So this is a kind of question about the positive view.
Okay.
There was one thing that I think I missed. So when we're talking about the non-monotonicity of knowledge on this picture, there's a sense in which, like, on any view, something similar is going to happen. That by strictly gaining information, you're going to lose knowledge that it might be the case that something else, right?
Yeah.
So what I wasn't seeing is what the connection was between your specific positive picture and that result. Is it that result would be hard to obtain on other pictures?
Yeah.
Okay.
And the reason for that was, I mean, like take a really simplistic version of the traditional picture, which says that might P is basically expressing compatibility of P with some contextually relevant body of information, like maybe what you believe at T. So then, my believing might P is just believing that at T it's compatible with what I know that P. And that was true. So you still think that's true. Yeah, but I mean, the fact that you so naturally gravitate towards the other way of thinking about my P is, I think, good evidence. Or anyway, helps to draw out that the view of defending is pretty intuitive, I think. What is this? What's the right way to model the state?
Since that was very short, can I follow up with another
Yes.
question? All right. Thank you. So I was wondering, so you contrasted, the usual kind of view where we have like the belief set as a subset of the proposition believed versus what might be going on in the case of indicatives.
Yeah.
So I was wondering how that would like show up in the semantics. So is like beliefs going to end up being ambiguous in this kind of picture, or?
Oh, great. Yeah. So that was something.
Maybe it goes beyond what you want to.
No, I have views about that. I just didn't. I thought I tried to keep it non-technical. So, but the picture I have is something like this. So you could start with it's an elaboration of a Hintika-like picture of attitude states. But the key move that you'd want to make here is to say that, say for beliefs, you want to evaluate. Well, there's a few ways to do it, actually, but one way to do it was to think of the semantics as relativizing truth to worlds and information states. And the belief operator is going to shift the information state parameter. So it would look like, can you see from here? Okay. So you have like truth defined relative to a world in an information state, S, and you have belief operator like phi, that's going to be true at a world information state pair, just in case. We'll have something like the familiar Hintika thing. All worlds compatible with what X believes in your starting world W are such that, and then what you do is you shift the information state parameter to the set of worlds corresponding to the belief world, to the belief worlds of the agent in the world of evaluation. So you'll do this. And then you'll pair that. I mean, here's how it would look for systemic possibility. Really simple. And if you put these together, and you consider like, well, what's the truth condition for EX5? You'll get that the kind of picture I depicted. And then you're asking like, okay, well, what about indicative conditionals? So I have a story about that. It would take time to describe, but effectively what the epistemic modal is doing is like placing a constraint on the information state parameter. And then like, thanks to the fact that the attitude verb is going to shift that parameter, it's understood as like placing a constraint on the attitude. So what we need is a semantics for the indicative that also thinks of indicative conditionals as basically placing a condition on this parameter. That's how the story goes. Arguably, it looks nicer actually if you give it a dynamic semantics directly, where you're thinking of the sentences as the meaning of the sentences instead of an update operation on the state of information. So you could do it that way too, and I think it's more elegant actually to do it like that.
Miguel Angel.
Yeah, I have a purely clarificatory question. And it concerns how your theoretical diagnosis captures what seems to be a very evident feature of the pre-theoretical grasp of the situation of the problem. That pre-theoretical feature is that it seems that the oddity, if there is any, involves reporting Seth's inferential knowledge that, if it's not Jenny's Seth, comes fully from the fact that Bob knows that his favorite student is Jane. Right? So, for example, if Bob hadn't made up his mind about who his favorite student is, but he knows that if it's one of the two, then it wouldn't be any oddity in him saying that, right?
Yeah.
So it seems that the oddity, if there's any, in him reporting the inferential knowledge of Seth, comes fully from the fact that he already knows who the person in question is. And my question is simply how this evident feature of theoretical grasp of the problem is retained or captured or expanded in your theoretical diagnosis, which involves a lot of theoretical tools, like lots of language, etc. How is that retained?
So let me think. What you're asking. So I agree that, yeah, Bob knows who his favorite is. And I mean, it does help the case. For me anyway, intuitions are a little sharper when we have one person who's Bob's favorite and then another person who's like not even close. I feel like for me, the intuitions are sharper than if it was a close call or if the corresponding counterfactual were true. If it weren't Jane, it would be 10. I feel like that would introduce a lot of noise and my judgments might potentially flip. So I don't think that's the only feature of the case that matters. But I think it's right that the case relies on, it relies on the fact that, yeah, part of what we're stipulating is that Bob knows his favorite is Jane, and like that's in a way what gets the whole puzzle going. And you're asking like, well, how does the solution vindicate that intuition?
Yeah.
Well, I guess the solution is supposed to hold that, there is a certain sense in which it's right from Bob's point of view, he should think that owing to the fact that Bob knows who his favorite is and thinks that he knows who his favorite is, it's that very fact that explains why Bob also thinks that I don't know the indicative conditional that I take myself to know. Because from his view about what he knows precludes the possibility that I could know that it might be 10. That's what falls out of the model I was describing. So that's how we indicate intuition.
So I have time to the next question. That's good. We still have time for my question. That is good.
Okay.
Okay. So yeah, I'm also trying to argue for linguistic. I think your epistemic account is probably also right, but it's true that you have told us not enough to convince us that linguistic is not going to work. And in the 70s, there was a lot of work about how presupposition and conditionals interacted and all these things. But I think you're right that it was not much of an account. It was more of a, so this is how presupposition works. This is how when it projects and it doesn't project. And that is why, when I say that Bob knows, even though I'm talking about what Bob knows, I am also talking about my epistemic state and things like that. But also, at more or less around that time, Data Wilson was also working on these topics from what would later be relevance theory. Mm-hmm. And Rostov-Naker and me are trying to revive that view of how to account for this kind of behavior of epistemic models. And the idea is that this is not a case of presupposition. This is more like just the fact that knowledge is factive plus Gricean principles, general Gricean principles. So if you do that, then you're going to be able to get why the general principles you ascribe to the presupposition theory are right, but as an explanation, not just as mere principles. So that is why when you ascribe to somebody else knowledge of the conditional, then you are also inheriting the commitments of the conditional itself, right? And then you're right that the the presupposition of the conditional is going to be the epistemic possibility of the antecedent for the person who is making the report, right? It projects. But then you say, well, but this is not going to work for. But do you have all these other examples with the thing, this one here?
Yeah.
And you say, well, here we get the same phenomenon, the same contrast. Why is it working here if there is no knowledge? And here is where the fact that you're adding the "and he's right" is going to be important, because "and he's right" is also factive, so it's going to play the same role that knowledge plays in the original example. So and I think the fact that you have a contrast here, and you also have a contrast in the knowledge, gives us a good reason to think that it has not much to do with knowledge, because there's no knowledge here, right? It has to do with facticity, because there's facticity in the knowledge description, and there's facticity in the "oh, he's right" thing, isn't it?
Okay, right. No, I think you're pressing me on just the right kind of thing. So let me try and articulate why I feel still puzzled. So according to this theory, I think this is indicative conditional. We haven't really said what it is to think that.
Yes.
But it sounds like what I'm wondering is, like, can we have a linguistic approach which says, I think a conditional, and I go and I don't know how to say it, but like my thinking isn't off. In other words, like, when I said to myself initially, well, so okay, I know that if my favorite student isn't Jane, if Bob's favorite student isn't Jane, it's Ted. When I said it to myself, I'm saying something true in my context.
Who is saying who? Who are you?
Consider the initial case where I just, like the very first few steps where Bob tells me what he says, and then I say, okay, so I know that Bob's favorite student is either Jane or Ted. So I know that if it isn't Jane, it's Ted.
Mm-hmm.
So when I say that, first question is what I say true in my context?
Yeah.
Okay. So there's some conditional out there that I believe, and I'm right in believing it. That would be the linguistic view in question. What I'm struggling with is like why I can't describe that. Why Bob can't describe my belief state with this. There is a conditional out there that I believe which is true, and indeed it seems like I'm saying to you what it is. Like Bob is just saying, here's the conditional Seth thinks. My favorite student is Jane said. Moreover, that's right. We just agreed it's right.
When did we exactly? No, exactly. I'm saying that there's a big step here. Here, so far, it's good, right?
Yeah.
You agree. Okay, so I think what we're debating is what happens when you add "and he's right."
That's exactly right. So, you're saying this has to be understood as adding
a commitment of a factive commitment to the person. Affective commitment.
Well, the problem is if we already agree that this things description is things relating me to an indicative conditional, which we already agreed was to a conditional proposition, which we already agreed.
No, because I think that maybe I'm wrong about what you mean by the linguistic approach. I think the linguistic approach is basically saying, yeah, you have this knowledge, but using the conditional is a bad way of reporting it. Well, I mean, it's a way of reporting that is not available to some people and not to others. Because the epistemic approach is to say that if knowledge is a kind of knowledge, and the linguistic is like, no, there's just, these report the same knowledge, but this way of reporting it is not available to I think that is the basic difference of the linguistic and the epistemic approach.
Right, and what I'm trying to get my head around is the following: if we are agreeing that when I say, sort of ignorant of what Bob's favorite really is, I say, oh, I know that if it isn't Jane, it's Ted.
Good.
What I say is true. Great. So then there is a indicative conditional proposition, I believe.
There's a proposition. And whatever conditionals are sentences. And that is the idea of that is why it's a linguistic approach. It's telling you, here is a difference between sentences, not between propositions.
Oh, you think I'm projecting too much into the initial knowledge? So you want to understand the linguistic approach as not judging the question of whether knowing Iffy knowledge is a relation to a proposition? Oh, okay. So, I mean, so then that's the claim I'm putting pressure on, because that's the key move in epistemology as well that I'm making, that like, well, we end up with a distinctive view in epistemology precisely because we have to reject that.
Exactly.
So then we're not really that far apart here. It's really more, I'm coming more from the point of view of like, well, adding that assumption, trying to develop a linguistic view which assumes that it's a relation to a proposition, is where you get into some strange questions.
No, it's the other way around, right?
Trying to develop a linguistic view according to which what I'm knowledge, when I say that I know that if Bob's favorite is Jane's Ted, if we construe that as a relation to a proposition, if we develop a linguistic view which assumes that.
A conditional proposition.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's going to get us into a problem. So yeah, we have a dilemma. Either we think that is right, there's no such thing as conditional proposition, it's just a proposition that can be expressed by a conditional, or we agree and then we have to get rid of the linguistic.
Yeah, so that's helpful. So just to summarize, the point is, right, insofar as they've raised some difficulties for a purely linguistic approach, it really was assuming that such an approach is trying to capture the thought that Iffy knowledge ascriptions are ascriptions which relate subjects to conditional propositions. If you give that up, then you're on my team as far as I can tell, because my whole claim, so of course I agree there is all this interesting non-trivial stuff happening about factivity that is part of the story, but another part of the story is the thought that knowledge states, we have a category of knowledge states that isn't a root, that don't consist in just being knowledge related to propositions. And that's something distinctive of epistemology, I think.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Okay,
Quick question.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know, I think it would be also, there would be also a contrast, of course, if between Bob saying my favorite student is either Jane or Ted, and Bob saying if my favorite student is in Jane, it's Ted. Right? It would be odd for Bob to say that.
Just utter the indicative conditional.
Just to utter the indicative conditional.
Oh yeah, super weird.
Right. So in that case, would you be comfortable with the linguistic explanation? It would be uncontroversial for you that the right explanation.
Oh, that's a good question.
So
so the case is, here's the minimal pair. Bob says the disjunction, other case, he says the indicative. He can say the disjunction, I guess, is your judgment.
You can say it's, yeah.
Yeah, but
Would be normal.
Bob can say, my favorite is either Jane or Ted.
Yeah. In fact, it would be another
It's
way
being
of saying
cagey again. Right? Yeah, he doesn't want to tell you. Yeah, so the question is, all right, is that asymmetry, should that be purely explained on linguistic grounds?
Because one might think,
I guess
if you go linguistic here, then it would be a bit odd for you to go non-linguistic, because there should be a connection between the two explanations.
Yeah, I think both asymmetries turn on semantic differences between or and if, for sure. So there's going to be that. However, I'm not sure if the ultimate story will be that different, because the unembedded case that you're talking about, I feel like I would theorize from the point of view of different effects on the common ground, on the conversational state. And the embedded case, so like I would tend to want to think of those cases as basically placing different kinds of constraints on the context set. And in a way, I'm saying that the same is true when we just think of knowledge as another kind of information state. I'm saying, well, there's these two different properties that one's knowledge state could have. And they're basically the same properties that your conversational state would have if you just say them unembedded. So I agree that there's an important, they should be treated as a package, but I think this story I'm telling would give you a package deal. Yeah. In both cases, you're theorizing about, basically this is a case where like the indicative conditional, I would want to say even in the unembedded case, is placing a constraint on the common ground that isn't tantamount to adding a proposition to the common ground. It's doing something else to the common ground. And when it's embedded under knows, I want to say, you're saying that the subject's knowledge state satisfies that very property that you would be adding to the common ground if you set it up as it. So I agree with you.
Ok, muchísimas gracias por estar con nosotros. Gracias por California hablar con nosotros. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Ahí, quédense con nosotros porque en 10 minutos, 15 minutos, Eduardo García Ramírez nos va a seguir hablando sobre aspectos filosóficos de la modalidad. Entonces, se va a poner muy bueno. Sí, van a fuegos artificiales, van a llegar los mariachis.
Seguramente.
Vamos a volver a mencionar a David Wilson. Seguro.
Yo ya vi como a tu burro dando vueltas.
Ah, sí. Que no vienen a esa plática. ¡Wow!
A menos que Moisés tenga una que
Ya se nos quedó el calor.
Pero también lo que es gustado.
¿Qué calor hace?
You working on Java nuevos?
¿Qué se le?
How do I go look? Say how do I go Yeah, it's a little hard to follow. The semantics